Let's talk about Grayscale Bitcoin Trust. What is it exactly? So basically the difference between a trust and an ETF is pretty simple. First of all, a trust is a closed-ended fund. That means there is a fixed number of shares in the trust and the new shares cannot be created or redeemed. The price of a trust share is determined by supply and demand, not necessarily by what the market price of the actual asset is. And another interesting thing is that a trust share can be bought and sold at a discount or at a premium, meaning that if the demand is low, you can buy an asset much lower than what its current market price is, and on the vice versa, if demands are higher, you can buy the same asset for a much higher price in regard to the market price of that asset. Now, how is ETFs different from this? First of all, ETF is an open-ended fund. This means that new shares can be created and redeemed at any time. You can anytime create new shares, you can anytime redeem the old shares. And the price of an ETF is generally very close to the price of the exact market value of that asset. That means there is no concept of a premium or a discounted price on ETFs. So why is an ETF much more attractive than a trust? Or let's say, why is it more regulatory complex to create an ETF than to create a trust? Basically two things. First of all, an ETF is a much more flexible asset, and number two, it has got much higher, much broader investor scopes. That is exactly why Grayscale Bitcoin Trust has been trying to convert the trust into an ETF. So they filed an application to the SEC last year, but the SEC rejected it. Now the SEC has rejected a lot of similar Bitcoin ETF applications, or specifically spot Bitcoin applications. So why is that? Now I have already created a whole topic about BTC ETF. You can check out here. Let's break down exactly what happened. SEC rejected the applications on ground of asset surveillance. Now what is asset surveillance? Now if you want to create a spot Bitcoin ETF, you have to actually own a certain amount of Bitcoin against which you are issuing the ETF. Now that Bitcoin, that amount of Bitcoin has to be stored somewhere, so that the market regulators, which is essentially the SEC, Department of Justice, and other people who can actively monitor it. So you have to store it somewhere. Now in this case, BlackRock, Invesco, Fidelity, all of them have named Coinbase as their custodian. That means whatever Bitcoin they have or whatever amount of Bitcoin they will buy, they will essentially give Coinbase to store it. And the crypto regulators can surveil whatever they want to surveil through Coinbase. That is essentially the concept of asset surveillance in cases of ETFs. So what SEC is saying is pretty much in this case of Bitcoin is that Grayscale can somehow manipulate the market by undermining the asset surveillance process. Therefore, the SEC is rejecting Grayscale's application. Now, Grayscale is arguing that the SEC has already approved Bitcoin futures ETF, which is true. And the asset surveillance protocols between a Bitcoin futures ETF and a Bitcoin spots ETF are pretty much the same. So that's why they sued the SEC. So now the case was brought in front of a DC Circuit Court, where the judge actually agreed with Grayscale. They said that since SEC has already approved Bitcoin futures ETFs, they cannot legally refuse Grayscale on grounds of asset surveillance. Now, if you understand legal language, this is actually very strong support for Grayscale. That's why the market actually reacted so strongly, and the price of Bitcoin shot up, I think, around $700-800. So the question is, what's next? The SEC has got 45 days to appeal the decision. However, it is very unlikely that they will appeal the decision, given there is not really a lot of scope for the SEC to actually push back on this argument. Now, if they do, the case will probably be pushed to the Supreme Court of the USA, which will be resulting in a longer trial period. On the other hand, if the SEC does not appeal, the SEC will have to re-evaluate this application, and if the SEC cannot manage to find any other holes, they will most likely have to push it through. That means the first spot Bitcoin ETF will be approved. That's pretty much about the Grayscale Bitcoin ETF saga. We'll have to wait and see what news stories are developing from this. But as long as we're talking about Bitcoin ETFs, I want to just add another section here. A news recently broke that BlackRock has been acquiring major stakes in Bitcoin mining companies. Like BlackRock has invested over $400 million in the top 4 of the 5 biggest Bitcoin mining companies. Those are Riot, Marathon, Cypher, and Hut 8. That means if you had any suspicion that BlackRock isn't serious about Bitcoin, they very much are. And if one of the biggest money managers in the world is so interested in Bitcoin instead of fiat, I think you have got a decision to make.